At the first stage of the boycott, it is only something that is very scattered, far between. Only very hardcore activists are working on a boycott and promoting BDS. And at that stage, Israel is able to ignore it altogether, not even to respond to it. But then, when the call expands a little bit, and through the call for boycott, there is more information that spreads to the general public about what Israel is doing, the boycott continues to the second stage. And at the second stage, the boycott becomes a kind of test, a test for morality, in the sense that if an artist makes a statement that they refuse to go and perform in Israel, for example, then this artist is not considered crazy, but instead considered to be moral and to make a conscientious stand. And at that point, those artists who decide to perform in Israel anyway and don't care about the boycott are actually making another kind of statement. They're making a statement that they don't really care about the conflict, the occupation, the repression, and they're more interested in the money. And then also companies with moral sensitivities, with social responsibilities, are starting to make a stance as well. And they say, okay, we like to open businesses all over the world, but not in Israel, because Israel is a very controversial area with apartheid and daily crimes. And that leads to the third stage of the boycott. The third stage of the boycott is the legal stage, where companies are sued if they continue to cooperate with Israel. For example, if a company operates in the occupied territories and they have they're producing illegally in the illegal settlements of Israel, then this company can be sued in Europe or in other countries for committing a crime. And it's also the stage where governments are starting to make a stand. And governments are starting to say, we will not cooperate with Israel. So at the stage of the legal action is also the stage of sanctions, BDS, as of course a sanctions part. But the sanctions usually come only towards the end. And then finally, the stage comes when BDS becomes a business decision. In South Africa, the bank, Citibank, a very large American bank, decided towards the end of apartheid to stop its business with South Africa, not because it decided to join the boycott as a political decision, but because the managers of Citibank were worried that if they do not stop their cooperation with South Africa, they will themselves become targets of boycott, and they will themselves lose a lot of their customers. So they made a business decision to stop cooperation with South Africa, and that was a very tremendous blow to apartheid. So that's the final stage of boycott, when companies start to make business decisions, is already a sign that the policies of Israel are no longer legitimate, that the boycott movement is already widespread and successful, and that Israel actually has no choice but to accept the decisions of international law. What boycott has already been able to achieve at this point can be seen on each and every one of those levels. So it's true that we're not at the final level already, but we can already see signs of it. There's already artists that are making a statement they will not appear in Israel because of Israel's crimes, and artists who do decide to appear in Israel are indeed portrayed in the international media as only interested in the money, making a decision that is immoral. We already see a lot of legal action taken against Israel. So far, no Israeli general was arrested for committing war crimes, but there are a lot of Israeli generals and politicians who are simply afraid to leave the country. They're afraid to travel abroad because they know that they have committed crimes, and if they do travel to Europe, they could be arrested. And we even see some pension funds, some banks, Deutsche Bank most recently, who made decisions to divest from certain Israeli companies, especially arms companies or companies that build in the illegal territories, as a business decision, because they are worried that their financial holdings will lose their value as a result of the growing boycott movement, which means that the BDS movement is not as widespread as it was in South Africa. And we can't expect 100% boycott of Israel. We don't even want 100% boycott of Israel. But what we can see is that it's already gaining enough momentum to put a lot of pressure on Israel, and that Israel at this moment cannot ignore it. And there's a sense of panic in Israel. In fact, the Israeli economic newspapers are now running more and more articles about the boycott and about how this boycott can affect the Israeli economy and how the government can try to protect Israeli businesses. And more of the writers, the journalists inside Israel, are coming to the conclusion that the only thing that the Israeli government can do to protect the Israeli economy from boycott is to abide by international decisions, is to abide by the rulings of the international law. Maybe most Israeli citizens are not ready to really consider what it means to recognize the right of return of Palestinian refugees. They're not ready to discuss true equality within Israel to all the citizens. But they are quite realizing that something has to be done. And when the government will make a statement that something has to be done, the occupation has to end, the injustice has to end, then it will become a political issue. And then through political struggle, the actual contours of how Israel will abide by international law will be determined. The Euromed is a European program to try to improve relations with Mediterranean countries and especially with Israel. Euromed is one of the policies that Israel is enjoying very much because it enables Israel to gain much preferential status for exports into Europe. As a result of the invasion of Gaza, the European Parliament decided to suspend the upgrade of Israel's relations under the Euromed, but the European Parliament is now considering cancelling Israel's special status under the Euromed altogether as a result of the attack on the flotilla, the Freedom Flotilla. And if Israel will indeed suffer this sanction, one of the very first sanctions that the European Union is considering against Israel, it would have a very deep impact on Israel's exports. 2. Following the attack on Gaza in 2008-2009, the boycott movement has expanded very dramatically, and BDS was heard in the streets of many cities around the world. As a result, the Israeli Manufacturing Association conducted a survey. The survey of Israeli exporters was intended to find whether the exporters feel the boycott and how deeply do they feel it. About 21% of all the companies that were surveyed reported that they do feel the boycott, that they have lost money because of the boycott. On average, they reported 10% loss of sales as a result of the international boycott movement, which means altogether about 2% of the exports of Israel were lost as a result of the invasion of the Gaza Strip in 2008-2009. This is very significant. 2% may not sound much, but it is extremely significant for such a globalized economy like Israel. Because of that, the Israeli Manufacturers Association are censoring the report. They are denying the results of the report because they know that it is a boost to the boycott movement, that groups that call for BDS against Israel will be heartened and emboldened by such a success, which is, of course, not to belittle the tragedy of the invasion of Gaza itself. And finally, there are a lot of Israeli capitalists that are already starting to shift their investments abroad. Real estate capitalists and energy investors are trying to move more and more of their investments outside of Israel because they want to be ready that if boycott reaches a certain level, they can always take out their headquarters from Israel and no longer be considered Israeli companies. This is something very significant. Of course, Israel is very worried about that and they want to keep the investors in Israel. But if they want to keep the investors in Israel, they have to abide by the decisions of the international law.